Hi, my name is Randy Bush. Thank you for joining me for these little podcasts called Into the Words, in which we look at different types of books and reflect on them both in terms of life and faith. If you're interested in seeing some of the other podcasts, they're all available on the church's website at woodschurch.org, and you can see the other ones that we've offered in this series. Today I'm going to look at another nonfiction writer, and her name's Isabel Wilkerson. Isabel Wilkerson was born in 1961 in Washington, D.C. She's an African-American journalist. In fact, she was the first woman African-American to win the Pulitzer Prize for journalism. She went on to compose two significant books that have both been widely read in America over the last few years. And the one I'm going to focus on is called The Warmth of Other Suns, subtitled The Epic Story of America's Great Migration. Just as a point of reference, her more recent book is called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. In talking about the African American experience as a white person, there's a certain hesitancy that comes naturally in the process because it's so hard to speak about what someone else has lived through and gone through. And so we tell ourselves, well, I should read more about it. I should study more about it. And one of the best ways to do this is through a book like The Warmth of Other Suns, because the book itself is less about a treatise or exploring ideas as it is telling stories. And it's in hearing the stories from some of the characters, the figures that Isabel has interviewed, that we come to have a deeper understanding of the reality of the African American experience, the lingering stain of racism, but also the ways that we can move forward to a more just and beloved community. So just from the opening insert flap of the book, this is how the book is described. In this beautifully written masterwork, Isabel Wilkerson chronicles one of the great untold stories of American history, the decades-long migration of black citizens who fled the South for northern and western cities in search of a better life. From 1915 to 1970, this exodus of almost 6 million people changed the face of America. And with stunning detail, Wilkerson tells the story through the lives of three unique individuals. Ida Mae Gladney, who in 1937 left sharecropping and prejudice in Mississippi for Chicago. The story of sharp and quick-tempered George Starling, who in 1945 fled Florida for Harlem, where he endangered his job fighting for civil rights. And the story of Robert Foster, who left Louisiana in 1953 to pursue medicine, becoming the personal physician to Ray Charles, and had a glittering career that allowed him to purchase a grand home where he often threw exuberant parties. So through Gladney and through Starling and through Foster's story, Wilkerson then captures a bit of what happened in America and how America was changed during what has been called the Great Migration. Now that phrase may be an unusual one, so it's described in this way. The Great Migration is something that didn't end until the 1970s, when the South began finally to change, when the whites-only signs came down and the all-white schools opened up and everyone could vote. By then, nearly half of all black Americans, some 47%, would be living outside the South, compared to 10% when the migration began around 1915. By the time it was over, no northern or western city would be the same. In Chicago alone, the black population rocketed from 44,000, about 3% of the population at the start of the migration, to more than 1 million at the end of it. By the turn of the 21st century, blacks made up a third of the city's residents, with more blacks living in Chicago than the entire state of Mississippi. In thinking about this movement from southern cities to northern ones, it's not simply a process of packing bags and finding a new place to stay. All along the way, there was adversity, There were barriers, there were hindrances and indignities that had to be endured and overcome. And a simple way to understand this is through Wilkerson's description of what it took to simply ride a train from the south to the north. Heading to California, the Jim Crow laws were no longer the law after El Paso, Texas. The signs that said colored above the rail car doors went blank. It was a metaphor for crossing into a land without segregation. Colored rail passengers heading west were free to move to the seats in the white cars for the remainder of the ride to California. Apparently few ever did, too afraid to push convention, and with good reason. In border towns, freedom was arbitrary and unpredictable. Not every restaurant was open to black people. Hotel access still was dependent on local conventions and the owner's whim. An African-American traveler could never be sure where rejection might greet them, and the real border stretched farther by law than it had a right to. Now, if you were heading back to California, or heading back from California, the South officially began in El Paso, and there Jim Crow laws took over again for any colored person crossing into the state of Texas. And there began the spectacle of African-American passengers moving to their places from the integrated cars to now the Jim Crow cars. The colored and white signs went back up. Colored people knew to gather their things a few stops ahead and move before being told to spare themselves the indignity. Up and down the East Coast, the border crossing into Jim Crow land was a very real thing. One more example. Between Mississippi and Chicago, Jim Crow went into effect in Cairo, Illinois, at the southern tip of the state. So for a time in the 1920s, the ride to Chicago was going to be interrupted after the train crossed the Ohio River into Cairo, as if the train were passing from Poland into the old Soviet Union during the Cold War. Once over the river, officially in the north, the colored cars had to be removed in a noisy and cumbersome uncoupling, and the integrated cars had to be attached in their place to adhere to the laws of Illinois. Colored passengers had to wait, move, reshuffle themselves, haul their bags to the newly attached integrated cars, and then going south, the entire ritual was reversed. Railroad men now had to reattach colored-only cars, remove the integrated cars in a clamorous ordeal to meet the laws of Kentucky. Again, colored passengers had to gather up their things and take their second-class seats, reminded that they were now re-entering the South. Such was the protocol of border crossings. The subtle indignity of daily life was lived out very much, not just on trains. I'm reminded of Rosa Parks' own description of riding the buses in Montgomery. It was the common practice that African-American riders had to purchase their tickets from the bus driver in the front, but then re-exit the bus and walk around and enter the bus only from the back doors. And on far more occasions than not, the driver, in a fit of prejudice and just their own choice, would often pull away before the passengers with valid tickets had been given the chance to reboard. Another story that comes up about these indignities and these changes involves just a broad picture of the Great Migration itself. And this comes from near the end of the book. This is her conclusion. The Great Migration was the final break from an abusive union with the South. It was a step in freeing not just the people who fled, but the country whose mountains they crossed. Their exodus left a still imperfect but far different landscape than before the migration began. It was, if nothing else, an affirmation of the power of an individual decision, however powerless the individual might appear on the surface. In the simple process of walking away one by one, millions of African-American Southerners altered the course of their own and all of America's history. So perhaps over the decades, the wrong questions have been asked about the Great Migration. Perhaps it's not a question of whether the migrants brought good or ill to the cities they fled to, or were pushed to or pushed to their destinations, but a question of how they summoned the courage to leave in the first place, how they found the will to press beyond the forces against them and had a faith in a country that had rejected them for so long. By their actions, they did not dream the American dream. They willed it into being by a definition of their own choosing. They did not ask to be accepted, but they declared themselves the Americans that perhaps few others recognized, but they had always held as true deep within their own hearts. So I invite you to read Wilkerson's stories about at least the three people that she identifies as part of this great migration. In their stories, learn about our own stories and how we're called to be a nation that strives for true equality and justice for all. Thank you for being with me for this journey into the words.